Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look in the public test server, the PTS, for Year 7 Season 2, which is the upcoming season for us, as we can already play around with the Brandset, the Gearset, the weapons, and the exotics and such that will come for next season. Together with that, also next season's Modifier, and also a new game mode that they're introducing, which is Retaliation, which is actually pretty interesting looking. Everything will be timestamped down below, so if you're interested in one thing, you can just jump to that. For a lot of this as well, we'll be going over a pretty big spreadsheet that I've filled in for different things as we'll go over them. And of course, this together with the patch notes will be linked in the description, so you can jump to those and read through them at your own leisure. Let's go get started, as we'll start with those patch notes actually. As I'll link to these, of course, they're on the Trello board. They put them out there before the PTS actually went out. And it starts with the Retaliation game mode and then goes through as well the modifiers of that season. In this video, of course, I won't actually go that in-depth into the modifiers, as yeah, that can eat up a lot of time. We'll in-depth look at basically once the season is out. But especially here, I've already have prepared basically this modifier for next season. Is very obviously just the main modifier is the big bonus. And we'll look at how much that actually adds in. As yeah, there's a bunch of actives and passives, which we'll briefly discuss in the modifier section, but we won't go in-depth into it. We'll leave that for the final version in the next season. And of course, all the gear brands and weapon talents and such are in here, including all of the exotics. We'll go actually discuss what they mean beyond their stats, because of course, just this much weapon damage, well, what does it actually mean and how does it stack up against other things? That's much more interesting to me. So yeah, this is here if you want to read through it for yourself, and let's go actually look at some numbers starting with the exotics. Although actually, let's start with the modifier first. As yeah, next season's modifier is going to be Divide and Conquer. As of course, with each new season, we get a new modifier. This one is actually based on how many zones you're controlling. We'll of course have an in-depth look into it. Here we'll just have a quick look through all of this. As yeah, we especially gain a rate of fire and weapon damage bonuses depending on how many zones we own in the current map that we are on. Now, this is different. So if you go to, for instance, New York, you'll just have 4 zones and whatever you have captured there. Brooklyn, 2 zones and whatever you have captured there. And that's of course per character and such as well. So you'll have differing bonuses. Now I'm kind of conflicted on some of this, as usually I mostly keep my map red because I prefer it that way, as I go after just doing the activities and such quite often. So I do reset my map pretty consistently. This kind of incentivizes keeping the map for these bonuses. As if we capture everything and the whole map is ours, we do gain 30% rate of fire and 30% weapon damage, which is actually, of course, pretty hefty bonuses, especially 30% rate of fire. This then also, that 30% rate of fire and 30% weapon damage is actually the big part, the biggest chunk of damage bonuses from these modifiers, as especially for this season, there is some actives, as we have 5 different actives here that can add to your damage or do special things that do damage. So for instance, here we have Zealot, and with Zealot, we do gain once we activate this, and actually we can activate it pretty, you know, it's once per minute here. And likely that cooldown with higher levels will go down, as actually all of these as well have levels attached to them, as we see on the top there. And for instance, in some of them I have a little bit of progress, and we get that from the Retaliation game mode, which we'll discuss towards the end of this video. Each of these, and I would recommend, just if you want to already have a look at them, is mostly, well, in the patch notes, it's mostly just kind of more utility. And then you have especially things like, for instance, this Say Cheese can be activated, and this is a cone blind, and we can still activate this every 40 seconds, and it seems to be going down per level up, basically, that we get for it. And that, of course, can be a very powerful tool alongside just replacing basically the Banshee Pulse, and you just use this as your CC. Some are a little bit, as for instance, spiced up where all your armor is stripped, and for the duration of this you cannot aim down sights or repair armor, but you gain a bunch of damage increases and movement speed increases from it. So yeah, you basically become, you know, just running gun kind of type. And most of these are actually pretty interesting, but none of them have a really big damage component to them, the way that, for instance, this season when we activated the actives, it was a lot of damage. These are mostly, there is some damage to them, but these are, for instance, yeah, CCing things. So for instance, this will set enemies on fire, this will blind enemies. This one, for instance, actually turns us kind of into a bomb, but then we also do an EMP explosion once we run out of zealot stacks. So damage component wise, it's mostly that main modifier, which is then based on how many zones you've captured. The passives as well are actually, there is basically the only damage thing in here is that we can, for instance, take a headshot damage against snipers by 100%. But actually, most of the other ones of these don't actually add to damage again at all. There are some utility and stuff, so we can get, for instance, things like movement speed by hitting a rusher. And the way that they're split up is there are universal ones that are against certain archetypes. So, for instance, eliminating assaults with headshots adds hollow point ammo. Although, actually, this is the one of the few as well that actually does add a little bit of damage. Assaults are plentiful, so we can kill them with headshots and get this hollow point ammo from that. Yeah, it's against archetypes, basically, this universal. But then the faction ones are actually archetypes within just against one faction. So it's Hyena Shields, it's Immobilizer, which is the foam guys from True Sons, Scorchers, which is the flamethrowers from the Outcast faction. And yeah, so it is, and Bleeders, for instance, being the Rikers, lieutenants that give the overheal. So we can take these when we're fighting specific factions or we're going after certain specific factions. Because, for instance, this one, which breaking a Scorcher's gas canister inflicts burning on all enemies within 7 meters of the target. Yeah, this can be used for some CC, especially when they're spawning. If you just get the Scorcher's weak point backpack, yeah, they will set everything around them on fire, which normally, of course, doesn't happen. There is actually some useful ones here, especially, for instance, this one, even without going for headshot against snipers, this is also has a component of if you hit a sniper while they are in cover, they are forced to exit cover. So they just pop out, basically. And that actually makes quite a difference. None of these actually add too much damage. Actually, the only two damage components that are here is this headshot against snipers and this hollow point ammo, which is the ammo from OD, which does have a 20% damage component to it. So, but there's a lot of CC, both in the actives and in the passives, and just a little bit of utility here and there. So the main component especially is that is the Divide and Conquer global modifier. Hostile-wise as well, there is actually two that add to the damage of the enemy. So we do have this wedge where they're outgoing damage to themselves and their allies. And this one is, yeah, it will have lines going to the allies that are within the range. And yeah, this can go all the way up to 30% outgoing damage from the enemy side of things. We do also have this one, which is Out of Mind. This one is actually if you leave an enemy alone. So if we leave them alone for 5 seconds without them taking any damage, any damage will reset this. They actually gain movement speed and rate of fire. And they gain that up to 30% rate of fire against us. So those two are especially them doing more damage to us and maybe having more movement speed and such. And then this one has a little bit of overheal. So affected enemies gain an overheal equals to 2 times their base health while they have a gadget deployed. And this is then only for enemy archetypes that have gadgets. We can destroy that gadget to remove the overheal. But there is, for instance, this is basically the only one that kind of slows things down a little bit. But it's mostly actually incoming damage being a little bit higher, which for some builds does matter. So if you're running around with a tick tank and stuff, more incoming damage is not something that you're after. But yeah, we don't have actually, for instance, immunities for enemies that we had with some with some seasons, or for instance, current season where we have a reduction to our crit. There isn't too much of that. So we aren't gaining also that much damage. We don't have, for instance, current season, if we have all of our bonuses, we are gonna have less, a little bit less than this, but especially when we activated our actives, we could gain way higher damages, of course, with the crit. And because of that, we could exceed basically at double our damage. Here, we're not going to do that. Let's actually go look at what these numbers actually mean, as we'll look into this multi-calculator, where I've set up an Obliterate Striker. We'll take that as our basis, especially as well because Strikers, of course, has an RPM component, and also it's just the general meta still. Here, if we have 10% from the bonuses, as we saw in the game, we just basically, depending on how many zones we've captured and or contesting, basically, and contested just means that we've captured a control point in that zone, but not all of it, and then the captured zones are everything's captured in that zone. We gain a percentage, and then that goes all the way up to 30% if we have all the zone captured. Now, capturing all the zones again in Brooklyn or such is just basically 2 zones, so you can do it very quickly. In New York, the same. But depending on how many zones we have captured, yeah, we can get up to the 30% on both weapon damage and rate of fire. If we have that 30% both on weapon damage and rate of fire, here we see that it is a 40% increase to our damage. This then being, yeah, a striker, which already adds into our rate of fire, and of course already being a full red as well. So that, yeah, it is already heavily diminished, basically, the return on it. We see that as well when we split it out. So here I have the RPM only, and then the weapon damage only, still at that 30%. And we see that the rate of fire especially is this 26% here. So the rate of fire especially is giving us a much higher increase to our damage. The weapon damage here being on a full red build is only 11%, because yeah, it's basically the same as adding grading on top. Although here as well, we have already grading at 30 there. So in this way, we can actually have 40% increase to our damage. That is a lot. Now, for instance, in DC and such, it's kind of hard to keep the whole map captured at all times. Together with that, of course, Retaliation kind of comes in, and yeah, if you leave parts of it too long, they will recapture it as well. But especially in Brooklyn, in New Woney map, it is pretty easy to have the full 40% here. But even if we have just 15%, so we have half the map captured, we're still getting about 20%. So we basically have an extra killer on top, we could say. And yeah, that is, of course, quite a bit of damage. I am actually kind of, yeah, okay with the actives and the passives not adding too much to damage, but being much more focused on utility, even though the actives have components of damage. But, and then the main modifier being the main damage increase, which we kind of saw as well with last season. And then also in this season, we could actually just run the modifier kind of like that, where we just keep the numbers high and then don't use our actives. But then also with previous seasons, we had much more, for instance, yeah, the reduction of damage from enemies or to enemies. So for instance, for this season, the yellow if they have a skill deployed, the blue if they have the blue against crit damage. Having those kind of things does actually offset it. And that's actually kind of the thing that I enjoy about the modifiers. You kind of have to just look at the enemy, see what modifier they have. And sometimes, yeah, if you have a whole wave spawning with blues, you're going to be slower. If everybody spawns and they don't have any modifiers on them, it's going to just be an easier wave because we have increased damage. This damage versus what the enemies have, I feel isn't in balance. The enemies do gain a lot of damage against us, which actually will be impactful against tanky builds. So I feel actually we'll see a little bit in next season. It might be better just to go all in on the damage and just quickly kill the enemies, because you won't be able to tank them as hard. Although, that still will be doable, but a little bit less so, because yeah, if they have 30% RPM or 30% damage against this extra, they tear through, for instance, yeah, shields and stuff much quicker. But we'll see kind of how that lands next season. I'm actually looking kind of forward to this one as especially the mini game kind of trying to have zones captured and stuff, especially together with the Retaliation game mode that we'll get with next season. They'll, I feel, work together well. Overall, I'm perfectly happy with the numbers and such of this as it stands now. And yeah, we'll kind of see how it actually works out a little bit more so in the coming season. I'll definitely do an in-depth look on it on the final version once we have it, of course. Now let's actually go into some of the gear and weapons and exotics. And let's start with the Shroud Exotic MMR. This MMR is based on the M700 Carbon / Tactical as its base stats, as it has the same base damage value. And I've already as well added in actually these weapons and such into the DPS table, so you can go and look at them there. Now, of course, for MMR, we're mostly looking at base damage, but for instance, for the pistol, the DPS values matter. For the rest of it, this looks very similar to that. And then what we have, mod-wise first, we have 25 plus 20 from headshot for headshot damage. This is the same values as basically having the sharpshooter scope on a weapon, and then also the same as the Nemesis, or 5 more than the Mantis. It does also have some reload speed, which is nice, and some critical hit damage, which is just lost, basically. Then talent-wise, that is the interesting part of this. This amplifies weapon damage by 125% to the highest ranking enemies within the tier hierarchy. Now, can be a little bit confusing. Now, we have 3 tiers here. So we have tier 1, which includes all of these enemies, tier 2, which includes all of these enemies, and then basically tier 3 is any other enemy or skill proxies. So the highest tier here is tier 1. This one, if anything is there from tier 1, we need to shoot them first. But then also the way that this talent works is if there isn't anything from tier 1, but there is something from tier 2, let's say there's an engineer around, but there isn't anything from this list around, then it's the next tier. So this isn't just only this tier, this is the highest that is available currently. And available currently seems to be based on a radius around you. This also isn't for in combat or such. They don't need to be per se in combat with you to count. But if there is, let's say, a patrol on the other side of a building, which I've quite sometimes had, and I'm engaging, an activity or such in front of me, they would count against this list, basically, which can be very annoying, but it's also very controllable, especially when, for instance, assaulting control points and such. Most of the enemies are assaults and grenades with those, and as you can kind of see, they're not in tier 1, they're not in tier 2, they all count as tier 3, which is a very large percentage of the enemies we face, and rushers as well, actually. So grenadiers, assaults, rushers, they're all tier 3. So when we, for instance, assault and, let's say, outcast control point, most of the enemies are actually on the assault, especially their assaults and grenadiers, and then usually 1 or 2, the lawnmower ladies, as we kind of call them, the controllers, as that is what they are. They are controllers, and they are of that class. So we need to, if we want to have our bonus, if our first shot is against a controller, then we do get our bonus. Once the controller is down, it basically rechecks, or, it's always basically checking. If there is nothing of tier 1 and tier 2 around, which for instance with Outcast, there wouldn't be any more after that, then yeah, everybody is getting the bonus against them. This on hyenas, for instance, yeah, we do have shields quite often. We do have, for instance, medics running around, controllers for the RC ladies, and then also engineers. So we kind of need to memorize this list that we know that, for instance, engineers is in tier 2. So we would want to kill the shields, the medics, and the controllers first, and then the engineers, and then everybody else. But of course, what this also means is that, for instance, on something where we're using Headhunter, if on the first shot I can get that bonus, and it's a pretty big bonus, then the rest doesn't per se matter, because now we have a big Headhunter stack. And actually on the first shot, now here I've already pre-stacked Hotshot as well, as we're just running it with a Hotshot build with just Chainkiller Araldi, not even the Habsburg pieces. I'm going to take a shot here against this enemy, and what we see in the damage numbers there is 19 million. That is almost close enough to drop most names on solo scaling. And then here on our second shot, we're going to 65 million. And this is also a quirk of how the amp basically works. That separate multiplier, it is going actually in the Headhunter stack calculation. And because of that, it's pushing that up really high. Now here actually on the third shot, we're, well, I critted there. Let's take one again, but we're hitting that same 65 million, meaning that that second shot that we took, that was already the cap shot. That's how powerful this is. And I feel this is honestly a little bit too powerful for what it is, because once you kind of get the hang of it, you know which enemy types to attack first. And once you kind of have that dialed in, you can always get this bonus on your first shot. And it is way too high in comparison to the other weapons. Let's actually go look at those numbers as we go into that linked spreadsheet. We've scrolled down quite a bit, as yeah, this one's a little bit lower, as we didn't start looking into the Shroud till a little bit later. Of note, actually, we'll get this one out of the way, is that while it does have a scope, and it actually has a scope which can zoom, which is actually quite nice, it does not currently work with focus, which is likely just an oversight by the devs, because it's definitely an magnification over 8 times, so it should work with focus. But yeah, currently it doesn't, just to get that out of the way right away. Then we have the Shroud here, active, inactive. Now, of course, we could be hitting the wrong target. So for instance, if we are shooting an assault, but there is a controller, which was in tier 1, then we don't get the bonus. So we do need to shoot the right enemies, but it's quite easy to learn to shoot which ones, basically, especially if you're just doing control points and such. If we are inactive, we're just doing basically, yeah, M700 carbon numbers here. And nothing seems too much out of the ordinary. When we do have it active, yeah, as we saw, that first shot, 19 million-ish, that's a lot. That's close enough to, especially for instance, with Habsburg on top of it, yeah, we can even start on a named. Now, of course, if we have an add glass instead of, for instance, Headhunter, we can also, yeah, start on a named and just, that's all we need, basically. That's the highest enemy type. So that would be enough to just, even without Headhunter, just shoot heads and drop enemies outright. One thing weird that we see happen here as well is actually, it is double dipping. So on the second shot, in the same way that Hunter's Fury does, it is going into the current shot, and then also the current shot is getting multiplied by 150 here with Perfect Headhunter. But then also on that end of it, there's also another multiplication of this amp. So it's another 2.25 because of this amp in that. And what we see there is actually that the second shot is going into the 80 millions. Now, we saw it already cap in the 60s, and that's actually because, yeah, normally, for instance, for the third shot, I have it set up in a way where if the third shot is higher than the cap, it just shows the cap, because we can't exceed the cap ever. So with the stored amount of Headhunter. So here, actually, it is already on the second shot capping, which is, I just haven't never implemented that in this calculator because I didn't think that would ever happen. But yeah, here I'm proven wrong. But yeah, basically, it is the first shot and then the cap shot right away after. And this, especially on the cap as well, again, it's on the Headhunter stack. It is actually where normally it would just be the all weapon damage, the specific weapon damage, grading, the total weapon damage, the DTA, and the DTH going into that in the stored amount of Headhunter. This multiplier is also going in there. And that's why we see that 60 million, where, for instance, when it is inactive, we see 28 million, which is much more, you know, down there. But then also, for instance, when we compare it to Mantis, where its amp doesn't go into that, we don't see here, for instance, with the 50%, this being into the 40s or 50s. We just see the cap being a little bit more reasonable. Because if we compare it, as we have here, a White Death, both with Determined and Streamlined, a Nemesis and a Mantis, it is very close as we're comparing percentage-wise against that active variant of the Shroud here. The Nemesis is just a percentage point ahead. And the Nemesis, of course, is much harder to use. You have to charge up that shot. Depending on how you're setting up, you might be exposed for that time because you need to be scoped in. You can't be, for instance, just, you know, pop out and shoot right away. You can, but you won't get these numbers. You need to charge up that shot to get these numbers. And yeah, the result that we see here is that that Shroud is actually just in the ballpark of the Nemesis. And I feel that's a little bit overkill for it. This will displace basically things like Nemesis and Mantis and basically any other MMR without Determined, because you just wouldn't pick them anymore. Now, Determined, of course, has its own whole thing. And yeah, people that are using Determined and want to use Determined, they're not going to care about this anyway. This doesn't change anything for them, but for the people that do kind of like using some of the MMRs, this will displace them in full. Here, actually, I've set up one where it doesn't have the double dip on the second shot, but then also it actually doesn't go into the Headhunter stack in that same way. Because actually the calculator-wise, I've kind of finagled these ones to kind of take this multiplier double, basically, into it, where it is going into the stack of Headhunter there. This one is calculating the way it normally would, for instance, for some of the amps, because, yeah, for instance, the Mantis amp doesn't behave in this way. It doesn't increase the Headhunter cap. If this isn't going into the Headhunter cap, what we see is actually on the first shot, that stays the same because we're just changing the Headhunter cap here. The second shot, it isn't double dipping, so we're seeing a lot less of it. And then on the cap shot, it's cap shot. But then also on the second shot, this would just be the cap shot. This is basically, that's why it's in red. It would just be this 38 million. That is much more reasonable. Even though that first shot is still unacceptably high, this at least kind of solves it being in the same ballpark as the Nemesis and letting it do silly things. But then I would actually consider dropping this in general, maybe down to 50%. This is the same amount as the Mantis has when you're shooting an enemy that is bonused for it, which is them basically not looking at you, which you can also, you know, with a decoy that it kind of has built into its talent, you can make that happen. And then for this one, we would need to shoot the right targets. And with a 50% amp, this is still one of the top picks. It also needs to not double dip, because if it's still double dipping, this is still going to go into the 40 and 40 something million, basically, which is still a little bit too high. But at least now it is much more reasonable of a number. Now you can, yeah, pick the Nemesis for its much higher shot. You can pick the Mantis for its playstyle, or you can pick this thing for its playstyle. I feel this being 125% is kind of way too high, but they also need to fix that double dipping, because if even with this 50% it is double dipping, that will still produce very high numbers. One option would be as well to just maybe make this weapon damage instead. That would still be, and for instance, having 50 weapon damage that would still exceed, for instance, things like Streamlined. Maybe you make it 60 or 70 weapon damage even, and give it a place like that, because you would still, it wouldn't still be against all enemies. It would just be against, you know, you would need to keep the tier system in mind. But its numbers, as they are in the PTS now, is basically Ouroboros, like basically, yeah, PTS Ouroboros numbers or PTS Streamline numbers. This is unacceptably high. I feel it should be brought into line. Yeah, let's go look at the glove next, as we go to the overdogs instead of the underdogs. And this, of course, is going to be the next season's exotic glove that we'll get. This will come with a red core, crit chance, crit damage, which is good to see. Yeah, we kind of need those stats to be there as well, because if this came, yeah, with wrong stats, so to say, it would lose a little bit of potential. This then has the same tier hierarchy, that system that we saw for the Shroud, but then here it is amplifies weapon damage by 30% to the lowest ranking enemies within the tier hierarchy. So instead of the highest ranking, where with the Shroud we want to start on tier 1, on this we want to start on tier 3. So especially Grenadiers, Assaulters, Rushers, and stuff like that are part of this. Now, situationally, this can be very powerful, especially if you're kind of focusing down enemies. For instance, if you are playing solo, this will let you, for instance, yeah, you just go after the right weapon type, clear out this lowest tier. When there are no more enemies within proximity, you can move your way up. The thing is, though, that especially on, let's say, if we're doing legendaries or such, there are places where we want to quickly kill the supports, quickly kill the mini tanks, stuff like that, quickly kill a controller or such, or a medic. Now, that would be excluded if there's any assaults or grenadiers about of getting bonus. But this being a 30% buff is very large. And yeah, I found myself in a lot of places finding it pretty easy to get this going consistently. Plus, on top of that, there is, if everything else is dead, or if it's, for instance, certain fights, this is very powerful. So if we're, for instance, doing legendary DUA, for instance, consider this would be the top pick, because once we kill everything else and we then dogpile the boss, basically, they're the only thing left. There is no hierarchy remaining, so we're bonused against them. Same as well, for instance, Marauders is in here. Yeah, we would need to kill our way through these other enemies, but then, yeah, we would get a pretty hefty bonus against Marauders. But we wouldn't get that right away. So for some boss fights, like the Roosevelt one, I wouldn't pick this, because, yeah, there's going to be so many enemies that we want to kill. We want to kill the Marauders first, so we wouldn't get that bonus. But then with some other fights, like DUA, it would work the other way. Then as well, yeah, if we're doing Summit Floor 100 Hunters, once we reach the Hunter fight, I see no reason not to pick this. If we're going up against a Rogue fight in missions, in Summit, yeah, this is the de facto pick for that. And then the thing is that this 30% is a little bit too high. Let's actually take it to the calculations, where we'll see it, how it stacks up against some of the other picks, as we'll go into this multi-calculator here, where I've put in the Overdog here with it being inactive and active. We're also adding in a weapon talent that will come in for the Tinkerer in a little bit, because, yeah, of course, for the Tinkerer, we kind of, from going on forward from now, basically always need to include some weapon talents, because we're kind of, that's the thing that the Tinkerer does. It basically brings in a weapon talent extra. So we need to kind of account for that. So here we are taking it with Killer. What we see is, yeah, at the top, we have the Overdog. And when we go to the Overdog being active, basically, or being present as a buff against the enemy that we're fighting, we gain a full flat 30%. And we see that as well in the game, as I've checked the numbers against the in-game. It is, of course, yeah, as it states, an amplified weapon damage. It is a separate multiplier. It's just 30% on top of everything else. If we kind of compare it, actually, against the setup, and here for it, we're taking mostly Killers, and then actually, yeah, for the Tinker, we're taking Streamline plus Killer and Killer plus Measured, and then also taking actually a Bloody and Grupo. Basically, a bunch of different, and this is Striker setups. So if we compare Coyote, if it is in the right ranges of 15 to 25, and we've set it up for that, we can be 7-ish% ahead of the Overdog. But of course, if most, or well, even a little bit of the time, we're getting this Overdog to be active correctly, then we're gonna basically, yeah, break the back of the Coyote pretty easily. Tinkerer, of course, a little bit further ahead, especially if we're okay going Streamline. That is always the big thing with Tinker. If you're willing to go Streamline plus Killer being two big combos together makes quite a difference. But even then, this is 13%. This is less than half than this thing in the right way. And as we kind of discussed, if we're fighting just rogues, we can just have this buff. And that will, the buff itself is just by itself a little bit too large, in my opinion. Because if we then also compare it to, for instance, Killer plus Measured, a much more common way to kind of go with Tinkerer. It is still ahead of the Coyote, which we already kind of knew, of course, but then, yeah, it is still 8% versus 30%. Now, of course, again, this 30% isn't always going to be active, because, yeah, sometimes you just need to take out a mini tank, it's in your face, and yeah, you're going to have to do it unbonused, but it's not as big of a difference. At the end of the day, you will still go mostly faster if you're shooting the right enemies first. And we see that as well then, actually. So Bloody being 25% total weapon damage. Now here we're going with the Obliterate version of Striker, so it's not a chest version. If it was a chest version, it would be the only source of total weapon damage. It would be at its full 25%. Here, if we're just activating it, and of course for that, we need to either hit an enemy with a grenade or punch them in the face to activate the Bloody Knuckles. That by itself here on this build, which has already 20 from Obliterate, is only a 20.83% increase. And I feel this should be the ballpark that this item is also in. And that's what I would advocate for. So either being 15 or 20% maybe for its number. Because currently, as it stands, it is just a very easy way for some fights to really, make an impact there. And the annoyance for that will become that for some cases, you just will need to have that, have an extra loadout saved most likely, or being able to swap it in, hot swap it in pretty quickly. And items like that actually I feel aren't the greatest. When an item is way too situational, but in those situations is way too good to pass up, it kind of becomes a thing of just you have to have it, and for those situations you kind of have to have it. And yeah, you'll also get people kind of gatekeeping that a little bit. I feel if this is more close to 20%, it is much more of a thing that it is still a very big buff. It'll most of the time work out perfectly fine for you and be able to let you kill enemies much faster. But it isn't as big of a buff as it is now. Because especially as well, if we just have a Grupo brand bonus there, yeah, we're just doing all 3 and a bit percent. I should say this is with 20% headshot rate, because yeah, of course, with killer, that matters quite a bit, how much we add in there. Especially that as well, because if we are actually going headshotting quite a bit, let's say we go 100% headshot rate, all of those numbers with killer in comparison fall off a little bit. Because, of course, this is a separate multiplier. This isn't getting impacted by things like the headshot rate. The killers and the crits, for instance, from Coyote and stuff are, so they drop even, actually. So this, for certain situations, is just a little bit too good, I feel. Putting this maybe more in the ballpark of 20% for its bonuses, yeah, that makes, I feel, a little bit more sense. One last thing I want to discuss, both about the Shroud and this Overdogs, is that actually currently in the PTS, they are applying to the entire team. If one person is wearing them, you get these bonuses for everybody. Now, of course, that isn't intended, but yeah, I'll just point that out here. Especially somebody holding the Shroud in their hands. If one person is running that bit basically and just actually actively using it so that the talent is active, it is active for the entirety of the team, which is a little bit obviously broken. I don't think that is intended, but yeah, that has to go basically. Because what then happens is if I'm running around with this build, let's say, and I'm using just my FAMAS with measured, I just have that talent of the Shroud on top. And we kind of discussed how powerful that one can be, because yeah, it is basically doubling our damage against the right enemies. Yeah, let's go actually look at the third exotic, which will be from the climax. And let's indeed go to that Tempest, which will, yeah, be the climax mission item. So it'll have a guaranteed, you'll get it guaranteed for your first completion of Master. And alongside of that, it'll have a drop chance from any time that you do the climax mission on any difficulty. This exotic pistol has one important trait to it, and that is that it's fully automatic. So you just hold down the button and it just keeps on firing. Now, it is based on the 93R, which is the burst weapon that we have, and this has a much higher base than it. So it has the same RPM, but a higher base. Then, of course, as all pistols, it comes just with 2 stats. It doesn't have a, well, its third stat is its second stat, because yeah, pistols don't have a class attribute, basically. Mods-wise, we're getting 50% stability and 15 crit chance. The stability does help out quite a bit, because especially compared to just a fully 93R, this behaves a lot more tame and such, especially on a build like this where we don't have any weapon handling to offset it. 15 crit chance is 5 less than most of the other pistols, because especially, for instance, a Cart 45 or such, that can have 20 crit chance on it. A lot of the pistols will have 20 crit chance on from mods. This only has 15, but that's kind of fine. Then actually, yeah, the talent, the much aligned restrained, and this is deals 25% amplified damage for 20 seconds after your shield gets broken. Now, of course, with most builds, or for instance, if we're actually using this as our main weapon on, for instance, this high-end bulwark shield tech tank, which is designed to be a kind of a high-end tech tank, but then kind of designed around the pistol and going with the bulwark. I quite enjoy this build, especially for instance, going through Summit with 7 directives, because we can very easily do that, and we have the survivability and firepower enough to kind of deal with enemies. Normally, I would be using a Cart 45 with this, but then actually, I think this weapon will definitely displace that. Of course, on this build, I never want to break my shield. And it's also going to be very hard for me to break my shield. So a lot of people have already looked at this talent and gone like, oh, this thing is unusable. It turns out that on its base stats, it is kind of Ouroboros style. So its base stats are high enough that that compensates basically for this talent. I feel this talent is mostly put in just in case like people want to use it in a creative way. For instance, with red builds or such, you could, of course, now that we have the Tinkerer and you want to have 2 high-end weapons, maybe stick this in as the pistol slot. If you have your shield out and you're clever about it, when the shield is about to break, you might swap to the pistol and then get a, this with 25% amp is actually one of the stronger weapons you can be using for that 20 seconds that this is up. But of course, on a shield build like this that is already maining the shield, I don't want to break my shield really ever, but yeah, it works out kind of fine because its base stats are good enough. Let's actually take it right away to those numbers. As here on the numbers end, we're taking up the Tempest here in this multi-calculator up against a card 45 with Killer on that same build that we saw there. And also a card 45 here kind of adjusted its RPM down a little bit, because one of the things is when we're comparing full auto weapons against not full auto weapons, if I'm just clicking, I'm never going to get that perfect RPM. The way that an automatic weapon, I just hold the button down, it's doing that RPM. So we're reducing its number by a little bit here. And then also we have an M45 here. Here the Tempest, I'm just sticking it into that build. It was normally made for card 45. We're dropping down to 55 crit chance, but that actually balances out. Here we have the 60 crit chance version as well. And it's actually a tiny bit behind. So we'll be going with that 55 crit chance version here. The Tempest with its base damage, and its base damage is basically 10k higher than the 93R. And that, of course, kind of compensates for its lack of it does have a damage talent, but it isn't a damage talent that, for instance, on the build I'm running on there, but we're basically never going to activate it. But then that's still working out fine, because especially when we look at the burst end here, the burst is as high as a Killer 45, or a card 45 with Killer. That's the same burst. Now, it does out-sustain it, and that's mostly down to a faster reload, and of course, not being as high of an RPM. It does out-sustain it by a significant amount. But of course, this Killer card 45 needs to activate Killer. I need to get a kill in before I get it. Now, that build as well was with Memento and Intimidate. So it starts as actually pretty weak, because both Killer and Intimidate won't be active until I get my first kill, get my pickup, and then hopefully get Killer activated alongside of it. So normally we're even way further behind against this Tempest, which is always this number. So we're not including that the talent into this at all. We're just taking the base stats of it. So on its base stats, it is actually pretty close, especially on burst, to that Killer 45. And this is also why we have that RPM version. With that RPM version, so where I'm kind of, instead of 310, 290. We haven't even dropped that much. We haven't even dropped 10% RPM. But yeah, we've dropped the RPM a little bit down, kind of to illustrate what normal use I feel would be, because this is as, likely what I'm going to click. Sometimes I'm going to be clicking too fast and basically skip one. Even though I've kind of have the rhythm of the 45 kind of pretty down, I'm never hitting that 310 perfectly. The burst, and this is with Killer active again, a damage talent on top. It is 6% behind, and now, of course, that sustainment is still okay-ish, but it's dropping a little bit there as well. The M45, which has actually a little bit higher burst, that's why I've included it here. It does actually exceed it on burst then, but then now, because it has a much worse sustain than the card 45, it is just a little bit ahead of this weapon. This, I feel, will be one of my go-tos, because especially as well, we don't need to activate Killer. And I'm actually kind of fine with the way that it's set up. A lot of people have been going on, it should have a better talent or such. I feel, they've kind of gone the Ouroboros route, where this weapon works out actually perfectly fine and can kill fast enough, but it doesn't need to trigger Killer, for instance, for me. This way as well, we can actually have the crit chance, crit damage on the 55 that we have, because I have no longer anything that really cares about this crit chance, except for balancing it out. And then as well, if I, for instance, accidentally am in a group or something with this, and I get Coyote or Vindictive from somebody else, it'll have a place to go a little bit. And yeah, shooting wise, this thing actually feels pretty good. It is easy enough to compensate. Its recoil pattern, interestingly, which I actually hadn't per se done pistol recoil patterns before, but if we lift up our mouse and just shoot a wall, it actually has a similar one, as we see here, to the AKs, where they actually pull to the left, and the AKs have a very similar one to this as well, where they kind of pull to the left and then go straight up. And yeah, this does take some getting used to. It is very consistent of a recoil pattern and very repeatable. So you kind of learn to recoil compensate right a little bit and then, yeah, just pull down. One of the things is, though, as well, actually with pistols and a shield, whenever we shoot, we actually have a jitter. And with how high of an RPM this is, when we're, for instance, using a Cart 45, this isn't too much of an issue if we're just firing. We still have that jitter, but it actually wasn't very noticeable until we, yeah, take it to these RPMs. And yeah, the world kind of just is as if it's, yeah, shaking, basically. Especially our character model is shaking a lot. That isn't too big of an issue, but yeah, definitely something to note. But yeah, this thing is actually, as it stands, a very interesting weapon. Now, pistols don't get mained that much. I feel well, there is some definitely that enjoy kind of this kind of gameplay, especially, for instance, I do. I know some others have come forward and gone like, hey, I really like this pistol build of yours. This will definitely fit into this really well and will be the go-to for it. I feel it's kind of fine for its talent to be basically not active for how powerful it is on its base stats. And I feel this will definitely, once we get through all the scouts, this will go into this build. It is, numbers-wise, I feel kind of fine and actually definitely usable. And also, I don't think this one, at least, as we saw with the last two, they were a little bit overtuned. Those were also actually, honestly, the two that were very overtuned. This one, I feel, is kind of on target, and I would say even some of the future ones we'll see in a second, maybe even below target. Let's go to the next one, as we'll go to the Brandset and its named items. So the Brandset for next season is going to be Urban Lookout, and this one is very much in the style of a Langmo, but then for marksman rifles. So this is coming with 10% accuracy as its first brand bonus, and then 5% skill efficiency as its second, and then 30% marksman rifle. Now, the way that, for instance, Langmo actually does see some use is because we could kind of see it in the way of this 30% marksman rifle damage. We kind of forget that this accuracy and this skill efficiency is here. We just go, this is basically 10% marksman rifle damage, 10% marksman rifle damage, and 10% marksman rifle damage. Basically, 3 10%, and then this is bonus. This is whatever's on top. Now, in the case of, for instance, the Langmo, especially, it, you know, fits in well because of the Pestilence, which scales off of weapon damage. In the case of marksman rifles, we have something similar in Headhunter, which also scales off of weapon damage. Although actually we won't be going and looking at any builds with this, I tried actually to like kind of theory craft where we could stick this, and especially for instance considering the hotshot builds where we do 3 pieces and such, or going for instance 2 pieces, going for instance 3 pieces of this, 1 piece Araldi, 2 piece hotshot, versus the 3 piece versus 2 piece Habsburg and Fox Spur and such. It kind of falls behind. It is especially that for instance, yeah, the 2 piece or the 3 piece hotshot, if we're already going the 2 piece, that 30% headshot is actually still a lot. And yeah, the 10% marksman damage doesn't actually beat it. I couldn't find actually a layout, even for instance, looking at it with Ninja Bike, where this would be ahead outright. But these do come with red cores. So yeah, these are a red core brand set for all pieces. That does make it a little bit easier than the Habsburg to get it, which does of course mean, yeah, that can be impactful because, for instance, yeah, if we're going with the 3-piece hotshot, you would definitely want the Habsburg pieces, especially on that one, because that would, 2-piece Habsburg, Fox Spur, 2-piece hotshot is one of the go-to builds. Here, though, you could actually do it with 3-piece of this, plus 1-piece Araldi, and then 2-piece hotshot, and you would actually get decent results. And you wouldn't need super unicorn. So there is that. But yeah, it is, I don't think, as impactful as some of the other brands that we've gotten in, for instance, Via or Lengmo, mostly because we already had Aroldi and Habsburg. So we already had a 10% bonus on the first piece or a 20% bonus on the second piece. Here, getting a 30% bonus on the third piece isn't as impactful because on those other ones, yeah, we were just, we have 2 now. You could, of course, make 3 piece of this, 2 piece of Habsburg, and 1 piece Aroldi, although Fox's Prayer would actually exceed that, 1 piece Aroldi. That, that still doesn't work out, for instance, against, Hotshot, because Hotshot's bonuses are actually pretty good for 3 piece, because also on the 2 piece, we get 30% damage, which is what this is competing as. Honestly, I haven't really found the place to stick this. I've been considering, well, maybe if we get the skill efficiency to do something, but I feel as well 5% skill efficiency isn't worth, for instance, to really align it in some way. This would, of course, kind of impact a little bit Achilles and such, but yeah, it isn't that impactful. It's also just 5%. Then for the names of this urban lookout that we have here, we have actually the Slight, and then this as its flavor text is, "I'm feeling generous. Are you really?" The thing is with this that we get perfect protected reload. Now, protected reload is just a talent we just never use. The perfect one will not change that. This grants plus 40% bonus armor while reloading. This also does it group-wide, actually. Grants 0 to 30% of your armor as bonus armor to all other allies when they are reloading based on your blue core attributes. So the thing is with this is, how often do you care about having bonus armor while reloading? I wouldn't at all. Now, bonus armor, for instance, triggering it in some ways for instance, Intimidate can be really powerful, but of course, this is a chest talent. And of course, while you're reloading, you're not doing damage. This would have been much more interesting if they actually added it maybe so that it was grants 40% bonus armor while reloading and 2 seconds after or something like that. That could actually be an interesting thing, but yeah, it just being while reloading and just being a group bonus here, we haven't used protected reload ever, and we're likely not going to do so in the future. That's not going to change anything. It's basically, honestly, a filler item, I feel. The other one is Spot On, and this comes with a perfect stat. This is a holster, and this comes always with this 38% accuracy, which is, of course, a unique stat. 38% accuracy, I feel, for the one piece, especially when we're getting also this accuracy up here, wouldn't be worth it, because you can just stick, of course, now mods on weapons are 30%, and you wouldn't give up a brand bonus and this up for it. If we're sticking it, and that's the thing that I was kind of considering, because, we could take it in that way. If we're sticking it, for instance, in a Headhunter build, instead of the weapon handling, we generally put alongside of Headshot, we would actually take this, right? This 38 accuracy. Although that's not that impactful for marksman rifles, because usually on those builds, you already have a ton of weapon handling. Adding 38% of this to it instead of just it being another 8% weapon handling is not a game changer. Although if we find good uses for this, likely we will take this alongside of Headshot if we're sticking it into Headhunter builds. For general use, for sticking this on, let's say, high-ends and such, or just on red builds, I would just stick an 30% mod on a weapon, and that's going to cost you a lot less. Because here, if we're just taking the one piece, and we're just taking it for this, let's say we want to just stick it in a striker, for this 38%, well, first of all, I would just go Eagle's Grasp and take 15% weapon handling, which will also, be accuracy, stability, and reload speed and swap speed. I would prefer that, actually. If we really want this accuracy, we would just take a weapon mod. Because here, especially as well, alongside of it, losing this brand bonus, that's a big ask. Overall, this gear set, I'm curious to see if we find some loadouts where this will make sense. I think definitely for people, that aren't per se going for the Habsburg pieces and such, this is a way to go. But I feel as well, if you're not going for those anyway, just going 4-piece Hotshot and just basically Chainkiller Aroldi or Chainkiller Gift or just Chainkiller plus Providence. That works out to be a much more impactful build than you could make with this, I feel. But I'm curious to see what people will maybe find. There might be some weird quirks that people find that this might be useful for. I do think, just for that it is a red core pieces, and we can get 3 pieces of this, maybe with a Fox Spur and an RLD. Although, well, actually, you would go 2-piece hotshot at that point. That might work out well enough, and then you don't need the Habsburg pieces. But in general, this is, I feel, a little bit of a lackluster brand set. Next up, we'll go to the Gearset, which is tipping scales. Tipping scales on its 2-piece, it'll have magazine size. On its 3-piece, it'll have LMG damage, and then 30% on each of those. And 30% LMG damage, of course, is a little bit more than some of the other gear sets get. For instance, if we compare it to Hunter's Furies, SMG, and such, and shotgun, that's 15. Heartbreakers, AR, and LMG is 15. So this actually has a hefty bonus there, just to LMGs. And then on its 4-piece, it is shooting build stacks to a max of 50. And actually this shooting, because when I first read this, I went just internally, just automatically, stacking build, Heartbreaker style, Striker style, shooting and hitting the enemies. No. Shooting build stacks to a max of 50. So actually what it doesn't say here is that if in each of the seconds, it's checking per second basically, if in that second you have fired a shot, you will get 5 stacks. I feel that needs to be made clear within this talent because if that text was in there, I would have never assumed otherwise. And then each stacks provides plus 5% weapon handling and plus 2% critical hit damage. So meaning that at 50 stacks, we would have 25% weapon damage and 100 critical hit damage. And then also we lose 6 stacks per second while not shooting, which is a lot higher than, for instance, Strikers. Even at going from 100 to 200 stacks area, for Strikers, it is 3 stacks lost per second. This is 6. This is double of that. And even then, for instance, Heartbreaker loses 2 stacks per second. This is losing 6. So you lose your buff pretty quickly, especially as it's also not as large of a stacking number here. No stacks are lost if an enemy is suppressed. So if we're shooting or an enemy is currently suppressed, we don't lose stacks, and we just keep our amount. And then if we are shooting, we gain to it. Now the backpack, and that's the better piece, I feel, this increases the critical hit damage received per stacks from 2 to 4. Now, especially what this allows us to do, well, this isn't actually too much more than, for instance, sticking in a damage talent here. What it especially provides us is, for instance, here that I can bring in the Coyote, of course. The chest, on the other hand, actually increases our stack amount, but not how fast we stack. So this increases the maximum number of stacks from 50 to 75. But this then also means that for that 50, as we need 10 seconds of having fired in each of those seconds, and I'm putting it like that just because we can actually kind of cheese it a little bit. But we basically, for the 50 stacks, we need to fire for 10 seconds. For the 75 stacks, we need to fire for 15 seconds. And that actually is the reason why I won't be going much with the chest. While it is a bigger bonus, and actually, as we'll see in the number, a bigger number, it actually having to fire for 15 seconds instead of 10 seconds is a big hindrance. So actually, the way that I've mostly been using this is just sticking in a Coyote, sticking in an Obliterate chest, kind of basically Striker style. We are taking the backpack, but then leaving out the chest. And yeah, numbers-wise, this already just brief napkin calculations the seconds I saw the patch notes, or well, we saw it actually on the live stream. Yeah, this isn't big enough of bonus to, be the new meta or anything like that. But actually, I feel it is actually still even a little bit too weak. We'll see it in the numbers. But here, let's first actually show this, because yeah, we don't need to actually be hitting the enemy. All I need to be doing is firing. So as I'm firing, you see on my buff debuff bar there, it is actually filling up. Now, one of the things that this means is that we can actually preset up our damage bonus. So if we know a boss is spawning, we could, for instance, already be firing. And then even if we reload, while we lose some stacks in the reload, it isn't that much. And then, we kind of keep shooting and we kind of keep a high bonus to it. So we can technically have a high uptime. The thing is, though, that the second I stop firing, it really quickly empties out. And this would mean that even going from one room to another in a mission or running between activities, we basically lose our entire buff. We don't need to be hitting the enemy, which is kind of an upside to it. One of the things we can do as well is just fire a few shots in each second and we don't need to per se hold the button down. You do need to kind of time it, as I did lose it there for a second, but yeah, as you can see here, I'm not continuously firing, but I'm firing enough still to kind of get it going. Now, of course, as well, if we're not reloading for, let's say, a Bullet King or something, yeah, we can just unload. Here as well, one of the reasons I am going with an M60 is actually its higher firing time, and that's as well one of the things that I played around with the calculations and such. Even at full stacks, and yeah, for instance as well, here's the thing that we can actually just keep firing, and once we have Obliterate kind of fully filled up, and together with that as well, we have the stack scoping. It hits perceivably high, but yeah, it isn't actually that high. Now, of course, here with an M60, we are making some bigger numbers happen. Let's actually go and look at those numbers, because here I have a trio of calculators actually, and we'll go through all three here, kind of comparing firstly what kind of tipping scales we want to go for, then as well what talents and weapons can make a difference to it, and then we'll compare it actually to some of the other builds that we could be running. We'll start off here. So we have different versions of the tipping skills. I'm going here with the backpack at 0 and 50 stacks, because also we kind of need to know at empty how much damage it does, and at full as well. And here we have the backpack variant at 0 and 50 stacks, then the chest plus backpack variant. So we're taking the tipping scales, chest and backpack. In this one, I believe on the side it says here, yeah, I'm going with Coyote and Contractors. On the other one, it's a Coyote and a Cheska chest. And then also one where we go with neither, where we don't take the chest or the backpack. We go with a Cheska chest and a Petrov backpack, actually, in that one. Because, yeah, normally we could pick Grupo here, where the talent is really lifting our crit damage is pretty high. So, yeah, we would gain more from a weapon damage brand bonus than we do from a crit bonus. What we especially see here is if we, as our 0%, we basically have the backpack variant with 0 stacks. Once we actually stack up and go all the way to 50 stacks, we do actually increase our damage by quite a bit. We're basically getting close to doubling that damage here with the backpack. We do need to fire for 10 seconds, and that's actually kind of the issue. So for instance, a striker going to 100 stacks, if we're firing, for instance, with an ACS, we can do that in under 3 seconds. If we're doing it even with, let's say, a FAMAS, which is firing at basically a little bit under 17 rounds per second, that's still in 8 seconds-ish, 10 seconds-ish. We're definitely going to reach its 100 stacks as well. In 10 seconds, then the striker, though, will actually reach a much higher damage potential. Because here, yeah, it's going into crit, and it's giving heavy diminishing returns, where, for instance, in Striker is a separate multiplier. Numbers-wise, already we can kind of see, because here we'll keep it on everything, the headshot rate on 20%, the armor rate on 60% here. We can already see on its DPS that even fully stacked up, it's in the 9 million-ish range, 9.4 million-ish range. That is pretty low. That isn't that high up there. And while if we do take the chest and the backpack, we can actually gain more damage, because we can do basically, let's say, a little bit more than 100k more DPS, which isn't that big of an increase over here. But it is a bigger number. But you have to remember that, yeah, we have to fire 15 seconds for that. I would much rather have this version where we have also Obliterate likely coming in much quicker than it as well, because Obliterate just needs, effectively, yeah, if we're on 50% crit chance, which usually we're a little bit higher, even if we're on a 50% crit chance, we basically need 40 hits for that. And yeah, 40 hits is way faster than the 10 seconds we need for this. And then if we actually go without the chest and the backpack, now we have a lot more upfront damage. We're going Vigilance plus Obliterate. Yeah, we are gaining, of course, a lot more damage upfront. And actually, we aren't that far behind on the 10-second version here. Thing is, though, that actually if we go, especially with LMGs, we have the option of going Tinkerer. Tinkerer isn't available. Well, it is available in the PTS, but you would have to just go and do the missions. I didn't choose to do so because it's actually a save that we have in the PTS is from before anybody got their Tinkerers, basically. So I haven't included Tinkerer here, but we could actually go Tinkerer, of course, and actually eke out a little bit more damage with double damage talents versus the Coyote that I'm running here. So there is something to be said for this version as well, where we aren't going with the chest or the backpack from the set, but I feel the backpack is actually fine enough to kind of use. Then if we move it on forward and kind of look at different weapons. So here we're going with the Mark 46s, the MG5s, the classic M60, which would actually be the preferred one to run between the M60s, even though I was using the E6 there a second ago just for illustrative purposes. And also the Bullet King. So here, first, without any talent on top. So we're not including a talent, or for instance, basically in this, we're having let's say we're running fast hands or something. Oh, well, fast hands would affect the sustained DPS, but we're running a utility talent. Let's say we're running preservation or something. Numbers wise, we aren't actually pushing it up that high. The difference between these especially is that the MG5, for instance, can outburst and sustain and out-sustain the Mark 46, but the Mark 46, of course, has a 50 round increase over the MG5. Here we have the firing times for each of these. The MG5, for instance, couldn't even fire the full 10 seconds. Now, of course, it would fire all that. It would likely reload for 2-ish of those seconds again, and it would lose 12 stacks, for instance, and then come back in and then do the rest of it. The Mark 46, and then, for instance, especially as well, the M60s with a much lower RPM, but that's still same pretty high max size. Although actually, yeah, we do get a max size increase. So yeah, we are at 130 rounds there for the MG5. But I feel especially the Mark 46 is kind of in the sweet spot where I would want to be. Having a high enough burst and sustain, and then while we lose against the MG5 a little bit, we have the firing time to actually get the talent going up and fully. Of course, with the Bullet King as well, we could go that route. Now, the Bullet King actually without a talent included in against it, yeah, looks perfectly fine. But then here we have we're taking the Mark 46 as kind of our baseline, and we're adding talents on top to it, of course, damage talents. Here, once we start putting in killer and such, yeah, that's a big difference in percentages between, for instance, going Bullet King and such. Sustain wise, the Bullet King still looks to be doing fine, but yeah, especially against things like killer and stuff, on the burst end, it being so far behind, yeah, I wouldn't per se go that route, especially handling wise as well. Bullet King isn't that great. And then especially one of the standouts, of course, would be for this is using Tinkerer. If we're using LMGs, Tinkerer and then damage talent plus frenzy is actually one of the good ways to go with it. Now here, this is about continuous fire anyway. What if you already continuous fire and, prep your weapon in that time as well? You're eating up some ammo, you go into that reload, you trigger, well, if you have killer, for instance, together with frenzy, you trigger that frenzy on the reload, and now you're really going. That would kind of be the way to go with this, I feel, and especially Tinkerer kind of buffing it in that way. Because yeah, once we have frenzy up, yeah, we're kind of in its own league. But especially just having some of the damage talents in there, especially killer, pretty easy to activate, or just, for instance, yeah, measured here, doing decent numbers by itself. Especially, I feel, yeah, the Mark 46s are kind of my way of leaning into this because, while the M60s, yeah, kind of with their rate of fire, kind of seem a little bit more of a choice. They don't actually have that much more sustain, and you do give up a little bit of burst. It isn't humongous differences, and especially with this as well, we don't care, because of the way that it's actually working, we don't care about RPM too much. This isn't Striker, we don't need to hit as hard or as fast to get the stacks going, because yeah, the stacks are just based on us just continuously firing. So the M60 is definitely a pick as well. And then yeah, if we actually take those numbers again, so we actually have the same numbers with the talents as we had upstairs. We're putting the killer as our 100% mark now, and we're comparing it against a high-end red with glass and killer. We're comparing it against a UI Umbra Initiative, fully red with killer. The layouts of them kind of are here as well. Then as well, OD, both with Tinkerer and Coyote. And the Tinkerer is with Sadist and Pressure Point, which you can make out from the numbers there. And then also a Striker, just Obliterate Striker, not even the Chest Striker variant. If we take that Killer variant, so at full stacks for tipping skills, at Killer at 100 stacks, or Killer activated and it being at 50 stacks, we, at its best, it is way behind Striker at 100 stacks. Now, of course, Striker also needs to stack, needs to hit enemies, so it can't pre-stack. But that's also why I've included OD and Umbra and a Glass Red. Now, this is more than a Glass Red, but a Glass Red would do this from the very first shot and just do that. So it doesn't need to stack for 10 seconds to reach this point. And it just being 10% behind, I would kind of lean towards that. Or Umbra, which we can also stack while being in cover and then pull out of cover and do our damage. Now, of course, this falls away. The way that this build works is once we are at full stacks, we can kind of maintain in that range and be, as long as the fight is going within that room. So especially long, very long engagements, it prefers that. Umbra, of course, the longer the engagement, we are going to start losing stack. Even if we're going into cover while we're reloading, we're not going to keep at perfect high stacks the whole time. But OD, for instance, does. OD basically does its damage, but then not against mechanicals. That would be its exclusion zone. But here, especially if we kind of look at the new ODs with Tinkerer, and that's, of course, Tinkerer giving a lot of increase to OD, especially. The Coyote version already would outsustain it and be around the same burst, and just basically from the first shot, as long as you're not fighting mechanicals where they're not bleeding. But especially the Tinkerer version is just ahead. And that's, I feel, is the failing of this. Mechanically, I don't mind it. It's actually pretty interesting. We can actually have a stacking build which doesn't need to hit, which is on itself a pretty interesting way to go about it. But it needs to be more competitive. Now, what I think they should do is actually just change the crit damage values, especially on the backpack. If the backpack went from 4 to 5, which is what I've set up this field to be, if we take it to 5, now, with the backpack giving 5 crit damage per stack, it went up in its numbers. Now, of course, this applied to all of these, but of course, yeah, none of these changed. So relatively, now it is just 10% behind Umbra. And then Umbra, we could make the case that, yeah, Umbra loses its stacks. Of course, as you're firing, this would keep up its stacks as long as you're firing, so you could keep up into its numbers. And at the very least, what it does is it basically matches up against the OD with Tinkerer. Now, of course, this being a build with Coyote instead of Tinkerer, it would gain a little bit more if we went the Tinkerer route and, for instance, the 2 damage talents next to each other, which is also the way we should go about it, especially sticking Frenzy alongside of Killer, for instance, is a really good way to go for LMGs. But at least we could kind of make a case for it here. I feel if this is 5 crit damage on the backpack instead of 4, it stands a chance. And this also wouldn't be definitely the new meta still or anything or OP. It still gets its ass handed to it by an Obliterate Striker. A Chest Striker would, of course, even exceed it further. Heartbreaker actually is kind of in the same ballpark as this Obliterate Strikers. That's why I actually didn't even include it here, because that would also be kind of similar of a build, of course, and then LMG based. But yeah, it needs to be a little bit higher, because this at least puts it in a range where, yeah, we can, with its pre-stacking, we can make a case for it. So hopefully they actually bump it up a little bit. That's really all it needs, because mechanically for the rest of it, I actually been enjoying it. As we'll go into the weapon talent that we'll get for next season, which is Soft Spot. And yeah, we'll have the 2 named weapons that we see here to go with that, where we have the Achilles, and then together with that, we have the Instigator. The Instigator is an M44 custom, and then the Achilles is a USC 45. Now, the soft spot talent for the perfect, we get destroying a weak point grants plus 24 weapon damage for 15 seconds. The normal version is 19 weapon damage, and this is just pure weapon damage. This is just the normal stat for it. It is actually, to me, a little bit too low numbers wise, as we kind of discussed, some of like the Shroud and Overdog I feel are a little bit overtuned, especially the Gearset and this I feel are, and this weapon talent is a little bit undertuned. Now, breaking weak points is actually a thing that I, for instance, do a lot, and getting a bonus for triggering that, because you could also, for instance, this is unlike an on-kill trigger. We can actually, once a wave spawns, for instance, quickly break a weak point, get the bonus, and destroy the whole wave going that route. One of the interesting things with this as well is that actually it works even on weak points on enemies that are dead. So if you're smart about it, you could even, for instance, if you're capturing a control point, when the enemies, after you flare, if you have, let's say, a grenade pouch or something on the ground nearby, you can just shoot that out, get the bonus, and then go engaging the enemy. So it is actually kind of practical. It happens a lot. You can actually make this happen. Although for some fights, this is of course completely useless. So for instance, if we're considering again as well in the same way that, for instance, Killer is not a great pick for the first fights with the Hunters, this is also not a great pick because they don't have weak points. We do need them to have weak points to activate this. For a lot of general play, missions and activities and such, that'll work out fine. But yeah, something like rogue fights, something like hunter fights and stuff, this isn't the pick for that. Then as well, yeah, we can actually have it on any weapon type. So it is actually for all weapon types. This is not linked to any specific class of weapon. And because of that, yeah, we can actually have it on ARs and such. The two named weapons, one being an MMR, especially, yeah, weapon damage can go into Headhunter and such. I would just never per se go this route because there is much better talents to pick. For instance, picking just Streamline and not having yours, for instance, I quite often use a Revive Hive and a Drone. What I've been using, for instance, Streamline for is just, I'll take the first shot without putting out my drone yet. That way I can actually even start an elite. Once that is done and I have a Headhunter stack in my grasp, then I'll put my drone out and then, I lose the Streamline, but that's fine from that onwards. This for MMRs, yeah, I just never would go for the weak point. I would just try to kill the enemy instead of trying to trigger this for 15 seconds. And as well, there's just better things to trigger if we're going for that. On a rifle, or especially this USC, the USC isn't really a great pick rifle-wise. I've been actually playing around with it on a rifle build like this, which has a very high handling. One of the reasons as well why I've given up Coyote is just a very consistent damage number, so we could actually check exactly when it was up and when it isn't, because, we can just internalize those numbers pretty quickly if we don't have the variation of other things. I wouldn't per se pick the Achilles. I would just, for instance, if the talent was much more effective, pick it on just whatever weapon I'm kind of using. But its biggest issue is kind of its low weapon damage number. Let's actually go look at that in its calculations, which brings us over here to this multi-calculator. Over here, we have the perfect soft spot. Here, and we're gonna go with those numbers here first, actually kind of looking at how much it was adding, because yeah, first things first, is it actually just weapon damage, or is it accidentally an amplified or something else? No, it turns out in the end, if we kind of input the numbers and then I went out and shot enemies with the build that I was kind of showing there, yeah, we get the exact numbers that we're kind of expecting. And that lines up with it being weapon damage. So for a build, actually, so on a build like that, where we also had, for instance, VIA plus Fox, we actually have a lot of weapon damage with high grading on top, at least for the calculation here. Yeah, we are actually landing on it just being a little bit over 8%. And that isn't a lot for a talent. And especially what it isn't is higher than measured. At least, well, for instance, in this case, on rifles, we couldn't have measured, but on rifles, we can have other good things like Rifleman, for instance, as a competitor to this. Or just, yeah, for instance, Killer. If we take it here to just taking the normal version, so we're taking Lexi as our base weapon, and for instance here sticking it on a striker just as a comparison point for it. If we have it inactive and active, we're basically gaining 7%. The difference here being that, yeah, actually our weapon damage, of course, that was the perfect, was 24%. This is 19% for a normal version on that Lexington. If we compare it to, for instance, here, we have a trio of Streamline, Killer, and Measured. The thing is, the main issue for this is that Measured is already above it. So why would I average it out Measured here, which will just always be active, basically, because independent of if I'm hitting enemies or hitting certain enemies or getting kills or whatever, Measured will be active. Most talents, to be competitive, especially if they also have a component to them of activating in some way, need to be above Measured. That's also for instance, when Streamline came in, it is quite a bit higher, but then comes at the cost of, for instance, our skills. Killer, of course, needs a kill to kind of, at least a kill to activate, likely sometimes even more than one kill. And when you're competing for the kills with allies, or if you're fighting something where, you know, you're killing one thing, like again, the countdown hunters, where you're at the start of it, you know, you're just fighting one and then going to another one in the time in between, you will likely even lose Killer. It is fine for them to be pretty high up. For this thing, where we also need to do something, which is to destroy a weak point, which also isn't always available, this needs to be more than Measured, I feel. So when we're just comparing it outright, yeah, it is just a little bit too little of a bonus, even when active. And then, of course, this needs to activate to even really push up against Measured. And then, yeah, things like Killer and stuff really blow it out of water. What I feel what they should do for this, although actually before we go there, I have actually here the option to change the number of red cores, because of course it's a weapon damage talent. So one of the things is, if we actually were on 0 red cores, so instead of being a full red striker, we're now all blue cores with the same crit chance, crit damage, minor stats. Now, one of the things is that Measured does care about how much weapon damage is on the build, and depending on that actually is a higher value. Now, because also the diminishing returns on that weapon damage that this talent has given us is less, yeah, it does now exceed Measured. But a 6 blue striker is not a commonly ran build, I would think. Usually you stick a memento in there and such, which also gives weapon damage. And then let's say if we have a 3 and 3, basically we have a half and half, we have a 3 blue core, 3 red core striker. Here it is getting close to, for instance, being on par with Measured. But yeah, of course, this doesn't affect Killer well, it does affect Streamline a little bit. And Streamline even pushes up higher as well than normally, of course. So it is still a little bit too little. If we go back to that 6 cores, what I feel would be a good way to deal with this, and I need to move my head out of the way, is if we instead, for the normal, already have 25%. So here we're calculating it basically, instead of being a 19%, a 25%. That already at least puts us a little bit closer in the ballpark of Measured. And actually, I wouldn't be against the normal maybe even being at 27%, or maybe even considering that it needs an activation, and that activation, well, easy enough to do, is still a thing that you need to have available to you, because yeah, you need to have enemies spawning with weak points. I feel 30 is actually not out of the question for it. And if we take 30, at least now, when it is active, it is kind of on par with Measured. But then the reason that I would go, for instance, yeah, 30 and be fine with this, because again, as I said, we should be higher than Measured at the very least to kind of be competitive. This, of course, when we are with a lower red score, so if we take this to a 3 and 3, for instance, again, now it is, well, quite a bit of overall, 5% ahead of measured both in burst and sustain. So now it would be a choice. So now it would be for builds that kind of have already a few blue cores and maybe have less weapon damage or also have less grading, for instance, because here, yeah, we're calculating with grade 30 on everything, but not everybody has grade 30. So yeah, when you're pushing the numbers down a little bit there, then this can be a competitive talent. And I feel actually this would be maybe what I would go with. Maybe 27 for the normal version and 32 for the perfect, kind of straddling this line kind of. Because also the perfects being on the weapons that they are in top picks, especially it being on an MMR named as well. Well, I kind of understand it. I don't think it's going to see much use, even if it was a humongous number. But I feel being more in the, well, now it is basically, you know, around that 20 mark, basically. It being closer to a 30 mark, I feel would actually benefit it a lot. And then give it a place, especially, yeah, when we have less red cores going. And also would make it a pretty good talent to run, especially, for instance, for people when they're leveling and such. I feel if it is left at the number that it is now, that it is going to just, yeah, kind of fizzle out and falter away. So, yeah, we'll leave it as is here. But yeah, I would definitely say that this, alongside of the Gearset, definitely could use a little push up. And let's actually, yeah, discuss Retaliation, the new game mode coming in next season. And this is a game mode set kind of in the open world. It's reusing basically the open world and its control points especially. And what it is that as we do activities, missions, strongholds, or basically anything against the factions, as I have here on this new tab, which goes alongside of, it's going to be between the baddies and the SHG tab. We have a new tab here where we have actually status for each of our factions. So here I've already done a bunch of things against the True Sons. That's why I'm kind of standing here. I just did the activity there. That was enough to, that was the last little bit that I needed, as I'd done some missions in the past. Once we have this, we have basically 6 hours to make sure that this retaliation doesn't complete. And if it would, if I let this time out, it will capture the zone. That kind of course, lines up with the global modifier of this season, where it is about capturing zones and stuff. So if we let enemies recapture zones willy-nilly and let this time out, we'll lose a little bit of our buff there. So I would want to retaliate against the retaliation, or initiate the retaliation, as it kind of says there behind me. If I were to click that, we basically go into the zone. It makes all 3 of these control points red. It would set me to the safe house, or for instance, actually for Downtown West, it puts us at the campus, basically whatever safe area is available to it. And then actually it's pretty interesting, because then we have we can go and capture, or we have to go and capture those control points. There's a timer for it, and that timer actually is pretty well. At the start of it, we usually start with like 6 or 7 minutes. Then any kill that we make adds a little bit of time to it. And then there is actually things like capturing control points, and there are kill teams that we can eliminate. We'll come back to that in a second. Whenever we do those kind of things, we add minutes to our timer. So actually going, for instance, for this, we would likely start with 6 or 7 minutes. Once I capture the first control point, I would gain 4 or 5 minutes. And then from there, we basically have enough time to go for the other things. The interesting thing is as well, once we kind of load up into the mode, and we can actually do this as a group as well, and people can even join halfway through. They won't get full rewards if they've missed out on some of the control points along the way, but if they're there for the entirety of it. And that's actually the kind of nice thing as this, which it works pretty well for groups. And it's actually, I feel, even better done in groups. This is, while priority objectives are kind of more solo based, this is definitely the thing to do kind of in groups, because also, we don't share the same bars. So each person is individually filling up their retaliation. And the group leader can actually initiate any persons in the team's retaliation, basically. So once we start that mode, actually, yeah, we have a timer. And then also we don't get to fast travel and we're locked into this zone. So first of all, if we just kind of just walk out of it, we get a timer. And I haven't tested it yet, but I believe you just fail, or it might just reset you back into the zone if it times out. But yeah, there's a timer. We can't actually leave the zone. So especially as well for some of the places where, yeah, it is actually, for instance, that was a thing that we ran into a little bit with Southwest. There is this road that we would normally take to kind of go from this side to this side, but yeah, you can't actually, this is in the other zone. So, and yeah, we don't get the fast travel, so we have to actually run to all of these places. So for instance, one of the things becomes as well, kind of how do you pass it? Because yeah, it wouldn't make sense to go for that one and then come back for these two. Especially for the first one as well. You don't have that much time. You have 6-7 minutes. So you kind of have to get that first control point quick. And then, yeah, you get a little bit of time for that. So here, for instance, yeah, we'll run for this one, then for this one, and then go all the way up there. As we go through as well the open world, there aren't any activities or anything active. There isn't any of those things to do. But just the whole time, it'll spawn enemies that are aggro to you. So just you'll be, you know, from side to sides, you'll be accosted by multiple enemy waves, just basically like patrols. But yeah, when they spawn, they usually are aggro to you. Then there's also a special kind of spawn, which is the kill teams. That is a set of 5 names, and it's also 5 names if you're solo or in a group. This is also one of the reasons why in a group setting, actually, it's a little bit easier, especially to deal with the kill teams and such, as yeah, they don't scale numbers-wise, but of course, yeah, they do still scale health and armor-wise. And the kill teams, yeah, are generally 5 names, and yeah, they have kind of the health and armor values of names, and for instance, as well, the skills that sometimes names have and such. And yeah, they basically assault you. Now, if you kill them, you have a chance of getting the reward out of this system, which is the exotic blueprints. We'll go into that actually in a second. The exotic blueprints, we can get it from the kill teams, killing those, and we also get a bunch of time from that. But also we have a chance of getting some for completing the mode. Now it seems currently for heroic, it is 95% if you complete the mode, and it seems to be a 50% for each kill team that you kill. And you might run into multiple kill teams during one session here. It isn't just they are spawned in. It seems to be basically sometimes, instead of some of the normal waves that it kind of spawns that kind of just chase you down, it might spawn a kill team. Quite often as well, it will happen alongside of sometimes, for instance, the defense waves on some of the control points. And yeah, that can be very dangerous because now you have basically the defense wave of the control point to deal with together with the kill team. And that can actually be pretty overwhelming. That has definitely killed me here and there. If you die in this mode, you lose some time. And yeah, if you lose enough time, or yeah, you just time out, basically, you will lose. You will get some rewards depending on if you got a control point or two, and the kill teams as well. If you get a blueprint from them, it seems to be you just get the blueprint as is from the moment that you kill them, basically once you have all 5 killed. And this game mode is actually, I've quite enjoyed it. And especially as well, the thing is, in a group setting, it is actually not using up the person that initiates it, or the person, well, the group leader can initiate any of the 4 players' retaliation. It will only eat up the percentage of that player. So if all 4 of us are going out and doing, for instance, let's say, as especially as well as, for instance, we can be doing parts of, let's say, a weekly project or a daily project. Because if we're doing a daily project and we're doing, for instance, here a mission and a control point and maybe some activities alongside of it, that's likely enough to initiate a retaliation from this faction. And then we could likely, all 4 players would have full bars. We could just go in a row, 1, 2, 3, 4, basically do 4 retaliations in a row. So actually in a group setting, yeah, we can basically, one person can pay basically, and all 4 can benefit. Kind of like the HVTs in Division 1, if you're familiar with that. Basically, one person can initiate the cost and pay the price, basically, and then all 4 group members can benefit from it. And then, yeah, if, for instance, all 4 of us have True Sons filled in, it would only eat basically this percentage from the person whose retaliations initiated. The rest of us would just still be at 100%. So yeah, actually in group settings, that works out pretty well, and we've done a few of those. Also, scaling-wise, it doesn't seem to scale enough numbers. While health and armor are scaling, it doesn't seem to be scaling up numbers that heavily. I feel it could actually benefit a little bit from scaling the numbers down, maybe solo, and then scaling them a little bit up for maybe 4-man. As especially the kill teams, for instance, solo still being 5 named enemies. Yeah, if it's 5 named enemies versus 4 agents, or 5 named enemies versus a solo agent, even though there's a health and armor scaling difference there, there's also just an just overload difference there, because 4 agents, each of us can kind of deal with one of the names at a time, kind of, and the damage coming in is kind of more spread out and stuff. So, but this mode, as is, I've been really enjoying, especially kind of having to run around and kind of also be, because death does have a little bit of a downside. I'm much more running, for instance, tech tank, although I would normally be running tech tanks. But even in group setting, just so we don't wipe, for instance, having one player kind of be a little bit more tanky and such. One of the downsides of it is just doing control points. So it is just, a thing we've done a lot. But yeah, it is still, I've enjoyed it quite a bit. And then especially this game mode has a new set of rewards. As of course, what that game mode gives us is actually this new tab that we have here, which is exotics. Now in this exotics tab, the Retaliation game mode will actually give us blueprints. So we start basically without any of these blueprints, and I've played the game mode quite a bit in the last few days. And yeah, I have a bunch of them unlocked here now. So we do have actually a lot of the exotics, but actually of note, very importantly, so if we go to ARs, we don't have Eagle Bearer, we don't have Bighorn. So stuff that is kind of tied to certain game modes doesn't show up in here. Same, for instance, for Ouroboros, but also actually, for instance, Chatterbox. So things like Chatterbox, Liberty, Nemesis, that all already have crafting blueprints or like through a crafting thing that you get them, they are not in here. Same actually as well for the assault rifles here, at least, although I feel they should add that one is capacitor, as yeah, that one is, for instance, tied to the Summit game mode technically to start off with. But also, for instance, on the rifle end, we don't have a Vindicator, which would be from Descent. I feel some of those they could add. Yeah, definitely Bighorn and Eagle Bearer and stuff. Yeah, no. But Vindicator could be in here. Chatterbox could be in here. Something like Capacitor definitely should be, I feel, in here. Together with that, actually, things like Tinkerer and stuff. Because while the Master Mode system, yeah, exists for that, because yeah, the Birdie isn't in here, Provocator isn't in here. I feel those could stand to be in here. There wouldn't be too much of an issue or hassle if people get it through this system, partially because it does also cost a decent amount. So one of the things that we have here is actually new resources. So for instance, here we already see crystallized spice that I don't have enough of. That's a new resource system that they added in. They've actually even added in a new tab for it. So we now have exotics are here together with the exotic components being moved to here. So they're no longer at the end beyond the gear set pieces. But I wonder if they changed where, I haven't checked actually, but like for instance, Chatterbox pieces would normally also go here. I wonder if they now also go to here. That would be actually nice because yeah, we can just check them here quickly. And then here we have actually the resources that we have. So this is all, each of these 5 here are tied to a certain faction. So for instance, crystallized spice is from Hyenas, Cross Balaclava, this is of course from the Rikers, and then we have Outcast for biohazardous canisters, Military Dog Tags, True Sons, and Burning Ash from Cleaners. We actually also have a resource in there from for Black Tusk, Automated Defenses, which yeah, the system at least doesn't seem to, well, it's not set up to have Black Tusk actually do a retaliation, so I'm curious how that works exactly. We can also, with any of these resources, turn them into these broken SHD watches, and we can also just get these. And this is basically the universal system. So actually we have blueprints, and we buy these from Inaya. We'll see if that's in the final version working that way as well. But what we can do is actually turn from these resources, we can turn 5 of these into turning them into the broken SHD watches. And then from the broken SHD watches, we have the counterpart blueprint to go from broken SHD watches to a specific resource. So we can kind of transmute in this way between resources. Thing is that it is actually a little bit lossy, so you wouldn't want to do this unless you really have to. You would be better off just going and farming the faction otherwise. And then most of these, all of the blueprints that I've seen so far required 35 of this specific faction resource of just one faction. Together with that, a decent amount of weaves and tactical assessments. It does also require 3 exotic components, so it's not going to be worth it to just, for instance, once we're full, just burn some resources and then deconstruct it, because we're putting in 3 exotic components, we would just get 1 out. Which I feel this should just be 1 exotic component, or well, actually, yeah, that would still keep it at the same amount, actually, thinking about it now. But yeah, so this wouldn't per se be any good way of gaining exotic components. So once we're full, we're kind of full likely. And yeah, we get the blueprints from doing the Retaliation game mode, and yeah, it seems to be 95% chance on completing the mode, so completing the zone, capturing the entire zone. Which most runs and such depends on the zone a little bit as well. Some zones are bigger, have more control points, but then also you gain resources per control point. So if you're capturing a zone with 4 control points, you'll get a little bit more resources than if you're capturing a zone with just 2 control points. And then yeah, you do get the specific faction resources from that. And then, yeah, the kill teams as well have a 50-50, it seems, for each of them to drop one of these blueprints. So eventually we'll have all of these blueprints. And I think what this will especially do is kind of like in the same way that once we had the Descent blueprints for instance, let's say Devil's Due, for instance, is a good example. This was a DZ item. I would usually keep one in my stash. And, you know, just in case they changed it, or I need to do some testing with it, or, you know, somebody goes like, oh, this works this way with Clutch and I want to test it, I would likely keep one around. Now, of course, I can just craft for it because I have the blueprint. Same, for instance, for some of the other like Liquid Engineer, or let's say Death Grips or Emperor's Guard, which are also somewhat harder to get items, DZ items. Didn't use them too much, but I would keep some around. Now here as well, then for the exotics, for instance, in the, let's go with some holsters. Yeah, likely I won't, once I have like a lot of resources within the system, I might dump all my Imperial Dynasties, or well, I have one in the stash. I might just dump that out because we can always craft one if I need to do something with it in the future or something like that. Same for instance for maybe a Shocker Punches and stuff like that. Items that we don't use much, I could see deleting them, making up some stash space. Although nowadays we also have so much stash space that that's less of an issue. But this could definitely do for that. Another thing is as well, actually, as somebody in my chat pointed out, and I wasn't actually thinking about that at all of these resources and the blueprints are account-wide shared, also across to hardcore players or hardcore characters on the account. So what that means is, for instance, on hardcore, yeah, I use a lot of mementos. Once I have that blueprint, and yeah, for instance, if I'm, you know, I've lost several hardcores, I don't have a memento, I might have the resources for one, and then we can just craft one up. And that will actually be quite a good way of loading up hardcore characters pretty easily. Because yeah, we can go for some of the exotics, and then also already as well, we have some of the named blueprints as well to go with that. If we have Descent, for instance, in my case, I mean more. And then we can kind of gear and hardcore up pretty quickly, because yeah, some of the exotics like Memento are really good for hardcore mode. Same for instance for Elmo and such. Sometimes as well, Coyote is kind of hard to come by, and for instance in group settings, I usually try to run one in hardcore, and there especially as well. Yeah, you can run out, although even as well starting out. So for instance, in a little bit, if you know, in a few months, once we have this system kind of under our belt and we have a lot of resources and somebody starts a hardcore den, they'll have an easier time going through it that way. So yeah, that's all kind of this whole system I'm all up for, especially these exotics that have been added. I feel though, yeah, they still could stand to add, well, definitely, I wouldn't say things like the raid exotics and such, or, you know, Bighorn or Oreo or such. But some, like the master ones, I feel should be in here. And then as well, for instance, the capacitor and such, I feel should just be in here. But yeah, overall, I'm all for the system. And I especially as well enjoy the game mode, at least so far. And that game mode as well, I already enjoy playing the open world. And it kind of ties in with that anyway, where we'll play a little bit of open world, trigger a retaliation, go do the retaliation, go back to the open world, you know, fill up our bars again. And yeah, and I can see myself doing a ton of that. One thing I would actually love for retaliation before we actually take it out of this segment. One of the things with retaliation is it is just a normal targeted. So whatever we have targeted in this zone, that'll be our retaliation targeted. And it is actually, it would be so nice if it was actually the targeted loot in the same way that we have for Summit and such. Because I feel that could really elevate that mode. Because I already enjoy doing a lot of running around in the open world for loot. And actually this game mode, while on XP and such, I don't know if these are the final numbers, but they are not great for XP and such. But yeah, you get specific resources and specific blueprints, so we'll still play the mode. But it would be very nice, as you do get a lot of loot, but you don't really get to control where this retaliation goes. Once the bar is full, the game randomly picks a zone. And especially if I could, for instance, you know, have it either select a zone or that I could select a zone. Although I can see why they don't do that, because then you would likely, you know, always pick the most, or well, depending on what is the most efficient, we'll likely figure out if it's better to go for instance, Federal Triangle, whether it's just one and you do it really quick, or if you go for all four of an East Mall or such. But if we could especially, yeah, have the same targeted, and I think that would be the most elegant solution. Just to have targeted loot here be set to be the same as Summit and the Summit and countdown menu. Because yeah, there is actually a lot of names that are in this mode, and yeah, you do get a lot of loot. Interestingly, I also, for the time being, once you capture a control point, the loot of the supply room actually doesn't seem to scale with difficulty, which is something I hope they fix as well. But yeah, let's actually, with that all in there, let's actually take it to a conclusion. As that then brings us to the conclusion of this pretty long video. Although, of course, this is with all PTSs, there's a lot to discuss. And yeah, we do in-depth look, of course, at things. Again, I'm kind of going like, I should have maybe split this into two videos, but yeah, we'll just make it one big one. Overall, I'm very happy with the PTSs here, although there's definitely some, yeah, things that need to be looked at. I feel especially Shroud and Overlord are a little bit overperforming. Their group component that seems to be active in the PTS, that definitely needs to go. I feel Shroud as well needs a looking at, and maybe, yeah, it needs to be lowered by quite a bit on its amp, and then also its amp needs to not be active for the Headhunter stack, which it's going into right now. Because of that, it is actually overperforming by a lot, and I don't think that that would be the intention there. Overdogs, though, is just a little bit overperforming. I could see it go into the game as is, but then for certain fights, it would just be best in class, and that is, yeah, and would kind of, yeah, hinder build diversity for certain fights. Because of that, I hope they actually lower both of those to, yeah, kind of the values that we can discuss there, around 50% for the Shroud, and then maybe 20% or even 15% for the Overdogs. For the rest of it, the Brandset, I don't really see the use of it, and I'm kind of interested in seeing maybe what other people figure out with it. I'm definitely not that invested in Headhunter builds as some are, so maybe I've looked over something. I feel that holster, if we are using some marksman pieces, yeah, we could stand to use that, and yeah, the loss in weapon handling would be more than made up with accuracy, maybe allowing another flip of a mod on the weapon itself, but that wouldn't still also be that big of a difference maker. If we move on to the Gearset and then also the talent, both of those I feel actually need to go up a little bit. So yeah, I would love to see the Shroud and Overdog go down a little bit, and then especially the Gearset and the talent go up a little bit. As the talent itself is basically not competitive enough to be used, I feel, especially with a trigger element to it that needs to happen for it to proc, and then it's just too little of a bonus. I feel, yeah, taking it up to that 25% or maybe even 30% weapon damage for that talent is actually perfectly fine. Taking the gear set as well, I feel the best solution is kind of to take the backpack from being 4 to 5 crit damage per stack. As we saw with the numbers, that would at least put it kind of on par with OD, and that's a perfectly fine place for a build like or gear set to live. That would still make it competitive. It would still kind of put it above, for instance, some of the things that we definitely don't use, like True Patriot or Virtuosa kind of falls in that as well for general use. But it is then competitive enough, and mechanically it is actually interesting enough, as it doesn't need to be hitting enemies. You can just fire and pre-fire and kind of get the bonus already going, and then maybe the boss kind of basically spawns into it, which actually does work out well enough. But its numbers now are just too low, so I do hope they pull it up a little bit. And then we'll have the pistol, actually, of course, the exotic pistol come in towards the end of the season. And that one I feel actually is actually perfectly balanced. While it is pretty high in its numbers and yeah, kind of knocks out a little bit of the other pistols, I feel especially some of the other pistols like the Card 45 kind of, yeah, needing killer to be active to kind of compete against it. They could maybe work around that with a different talent or such, but I think they'll just keep it as is. And I feel it is actually acceptable for what it is. Sustain-wise, the Card 45 still kind of beats it, especially with killer active. And that then will become the kind of the trade-off point. Especially with that, I think, though, that this will, the Typhoon will actually have a pretty good place. And then the game mode, actually, I've been enjoying quite a bit. And I'm looking forward to actually going out and doing it on my real account and getting the blueprints there and such. And the modifier as well. It seems pretty well thought out. It's being mostly the damage being from the main component is actually something that I quite like. Most of the time as well, it won't be as big of a component of damage increase, depending on the player. Because yeah, some of us do have, well, some people keep a fully green world. In my case, for instance, my New York and my Brooklyn are usually green. Mostly that's where I go for my priority objectives for. If it's a supply drop or hostage rescue or such, I'll just use those areas for that. But yeah, my DC isn't, and there it will be just halfway bonus. And then the counter, the hostile modifiers are then actually pretty impactful. And then especially the actives and the passives not being humongous increases, but also just being a lot of utility and such is actually something that I do like. As I feel that will fit the balancing pretty well. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this long rambling video. I have yeah, definitely enjoyed the PTS, and it still will be going for another day. So I'll try out some more things in there. But of course, also we'll see the final versions come into the game, actually likely pretty soon, as it does look to be that this season is going to end September 9th, is kind of the current speculation. So yeah, we have a few more weeks, and then we'll get to actually play with most of these, except for the pistol, which will be from the Climax mission. If you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as it does help out, so do that little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we are actually going to go and do that Tinkerer video. That should have been here, but then yeah, the PTS kind of came in, and I definitely wanted to do the PTS video first while it's fresh in my mind. But yeah, we'll go do the in-depth look into Tinkerer talents, and yeah, basically what we can kind of align it with to really get good results, and also what it means actually, yeah, for instance, running Future Perfect and maybe Smart Cover together and such for it. So yeah, we'll go into that likely coming in the coming week. I hope you join me for those, and as always, have a good night.